I'm Sarah Chen, 38, and for 10 years I lived with the word missing carved into my heart. My husband David was on Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the plane that vanished without a trace, leaving 239 families in endless limbo. While the world moved on, I couldn't grieve, couldn't heal, couldn't even claim his life insurance because there was no body, no proof, just devastating silence. But last month, I discovered something that shattered everything I thought I knew about that night. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was buried by the very people I trusted most. What I found will change how you see one of aviation's greatest mysteries forever. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt the weight of unanswered questions or betrayal by those closest to you, like this video because this story is for you. March 7, 2014. I can still smell the jasmine tea David made that evening. Still see him packing his laptop charger with that methodical precision he brought to everything. We were sitting in our kitchen in San Francisco, and he was explaining his business trip to Beijing, something about finalizing a partnership deal for his consulting firm. "It's just 3 days, Sarah," he said, kissing my forehead. "I'll be back before you know it." I have his final text message screenshot saved on my phone, sent at 11:47 p.m. from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. "Delayed, but boarding soon. Love you. Can't wait to close this deal and come home to you." That was the last time I heard from my husband. The next morning, I woke up expecting his usual "landed safely" text that never came. By noon, I was calling his phone repeatedly. By evening, I was Googling flight delays. By midnight, I was watching the news in horror as reports emerged about Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappearing from radar. The phone call came at 2:17 a.m., an airline representative, voice carefully neutral, asking if I was the emergency contact for David Chen, passenger on MH370. The words felt surreal, like someone else's nightmare bleeding into my reality. "We're working with authorities to gather information," she said. "We'll contact you as soon as we know more." That was 10 years ago. I'm still waiting for that call. Those first days were a blur of media attention, government liaisons, and other families gathering in hotel conference rooms, all of us suspended in the same impossible limbo. We weren't widows, yet how could we be without bodies, without proof? We were just people whose loved ones had vanished into thin air. I remember David's mother flying in from Portland, her face gray with shock. "He's a strong swimmer," she kept saying, as if that would matter in the middle of the Indian Ocean. "He'll find a way." Hope is a cruel thing when it has nowhere to land. The missing person forms became my unwanted specialty. I filled out hundreds of them over the years: police reports, FBI inquiries, international incident forms. Each one required the same impossible details: last known location, circumstances of disappearance, physical description of someone who might be dead, might be alive, might be anything at all. The stack of forms sits in my filing cabinet like evidence of a life suspended. Date of birth, March 15, 1978. Height, 5 feet 10. Distinguishing marks, small scar on left hand from childhood accident. Last seen, security footage at Kuala Lumpur International Airport, March 8, 2014. 12:41 a.m. Living with missing instead of dead means existing in a space that has no name, no rituals, no roadmap for healing. Friends didn't know whether to send sympathy cards or hold hope. My sister Emma would call every few months with the same gentle suggestion: "Maybe it's time to have a memorial service, Sarah, for closure." But closure felt like betrayal. What if David was on some remote island, injured but alive, waiting for rescue? What if he escaped the plane somehow? The what-ifs ate away at my sleep, my appetite, my ability to imagine any future beyond waiting. The worst part was watching everyone else move on. Other families from MH370 held memorials, created foundations, found ways to channel their grief into action. I couldn't. I was frozen in March 8, 2014, refreshing news websites obsessively, following every conspiracy theory, every debris discovery, every supposed breakthrough that led nowhere. Years blurred together. I stopped celebrating birthdays. Whose birthday was it if the person might not exist? I stopped making long-term plans. I stopped dating, despite Emma's increasingly urgent suggestions. How do you explain to someone that you might be married to a ghost? The house felt like a museum. David's coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher. His side of the closet remained untouched. His books lay open where he'd left them, bookmarks holding places he'd never returned to read. Sometimes I'd catch myself setting 2 plates for dinner, then staring at the extra place setting like evidence of my unraveling mind. The letter from Pacific Life Insurance arrived 18 months after MH370 disappeared, its corporate letterhead as cold as its message. After careful review of your claim, we must deny death benefits at this time due to insufficient evidence of death. A death certificate or definitive proof of demise is required for processing. I read that letter 17 times before the words made sense. David had paid premiums faithfully for 8 years on a $750,000 policy. We'd bought it when we got married, joking about how morbid it felt to plan for death when we were so young and invincible. Now that money I desperately needed as his consulting business died with him was locked away, behind bureaucratic impossibility. Missing presumed dead meant nothing to insurance companies. They wanted bodies, crash sites, forensic evidence. They wanted certainty in a case built entirely on absence. My lawyer, Janet Morrison, explained it with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. The legal standard for presumptive death varies by state, but typically requires 7 years. Even then, insurance companies can challenge if the circumstances are unusual. 7 years. I was supposed to wait 7 years to grieve, to heal, to access the financial security David thought he was providing. The mortgage payments on our San Francisco home became impossible within 6 months. David's consulting income had been our primary support. My part-time graphic design work barely covered groceries. I took a job at a marketing firm, then a second job freelancing, then started selling furniture, jewelry, anything of value. Emma found me crying over bills one evening in year 3. "Sarah, you can't live like this indefinitely," she said, sitting beside me on our kitchen floor. "Maybe you should consider selling the house, starting fresh somewhere less expensive." "This is where David will look for me when he comes home," I whispered, knowing how crazy it sounded but unable to let go of the logic that had become my lifeline. Emma's face crumpled with sympathy and frustration. "Honey, he's not coming home. The plane crashed. Everyone on board died. You know this." But I didn't know it, not really. Not in the way you know the sun rises, or that gravity pulls things down. I knew it intellectually, but my heart lived in the space between knowing and accepting. And that space had room for miracles, for impossible survivals, for stories that defied logic. The insurance company's denial letter became a symbol of everything wrong with my situation, trapped between hope and despair, unable to move forward or back, suspended in a legal and emotional purgatory that had no exit strategy. 5 years after David disappeared, I finally worked up the courage to clean out his home office. The room had become a shrine to procrastination, papers scattered across his desk exactly as he'd left them, coffee ring stains on important documents, his reading glasses folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. I was looking for old tax documents when I found the credit card statement tucked between pages of a consulting contract. At first glance, it looked routine: gas stations, restaurants, the usual business expenses, but something nagged at me as I scanned the dates. The statement was from February 2014, the month before David's trip. There were charges in cities he'd never mentioned visiting: Seattle, Vancouver, then back to Seattle. Hotel stays, expensive dinners, transactions that didn't match any business trips I remembered him taking. I sat in his chair, staring at the paper, trying to construct an innocent explanation. Maybe he'd been planning a surprise trip for us. Maybe the consulting firm had sent him to scout new locations. But David was meticulous about sharing his schedule. He'd text me updates from the airport, send photos from his hotel room, complain about delayed flights and terrible conference coffee. These charges were invisible. No photos, no complaints, no mention of the trips at all. I called the credit card company, my hands shaking as I navigated their automated system. The customer service representative, Patricia, was helpful once I explained the situation. "I can see the charges you're asking about," she said. "February 12th through 14th, Seattle; February 18th through 20th, Vancouver; February 25th through 27th, back to Seattle, all charged to David Chen's account. 3 separate trips, 3 separate lies by omission." "Can you tell me what hotels?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The Fairmont Olympic in Seattle, the Rosewood Hotel Georgia in Vancouver." Then the Four Seasons in Seattle for the final trip. Expensive hotels, romantic hotels, the kind of places David and I had stayed for anniversaries and special occasions. Hung up and sat in the silence of his office, surrounded by the artifacts of our life together. Wedding photos on his bookshelf, coffee mug I'd given him for his birthday, the small cactus I'd bought him as a joke about his ability to kill plants, somehow still alive after all these years. Had there been other signs, late-night phone calls he'd taken in another room, sudden business trips that seemed rushed or vague? I combed through my memories like a detective, looking for clues I'd missed, red flags I'd ignored because I trusted him completely. The credit card statement felt like a crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about David, about us, about the life we'd built together. But I wasn't ready to follow that crack to see where it led. March 8, 2024. 10 years to the day since MH370 vanished. I'd organized a small memorial service at Grace Cathedral, something I'd resisted for a decade but finally felt ready to do. Not because I'd accepted David's death, but because I needed a ritual, a moment to acknowledge the weight of the unknown. 43 people came, David's colleagues from his consulting firm, neighbors, my coworkers, family friends who'd known us as a couple. Emma spoke beautifully about the importance of honoring memory, even in the absence of certainty. She'd printed memorial programs, with David's photo and the dates, March 15, 1978, March 8, 2014, with that question mark carrying all the weight of our unfinished grief. Sarah has shown incredible strength in living with questions that have no answers, Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears. But sometimes we need to create our own closure, our own peace, even when the world can't give us the endings we desperately want. I was barely holding myself together when I noticed him, a man in his 50s, sitting in the back pew, someone I didn't recognize. He had the weathered look of someone who'd worked outdoors, salt and pepper hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stayed through the entire service but left quickly during the reception. I caught up with him in the parking lot. "Excuse me, I don't think we've met. Are you a friend of David's?" He turned, and I saw something cross his face: recognition, guilt, maybe both. "I'm Marcus Sullivan. I worked with David occasionally, consulting projects through his firm." Marcus. The name felt familiar, like something David had mentioned in passing. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to know people still remember him." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry for your loss. David was a good man who got mixed up in something complicated." "What do you mean?" He glanced around the parking lot as if checking for listeners. "What David was really doing that week. It wasn't the consulting trip you probably think it was, but I've said too much already." Before I could respond, he was walking away, leaving me standing between parked cars with my heart racing and my mind spinning. What did he mean? What David was really doing? What consulting trip was he referring to? I called after him, but Marcus was already starting his car, pulling away with the kind of urgency that suggested he regretted the conversation entirely. I found Marcus's phone number through his consulting firm's website and called him 3 days later. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting my call. "Mrs. Chen, please," I said. "I need to understand what you meant about David. You can't just drop a comment like that and walk away." There was a long pause. "Can you meet me for coffee, somewhere private?" We met at a small cafe in Mill Valley, away from the city, away from anyone who might know either of us. Marcus looked even more uncomfortable in daylight, fidgeting with his coffee cup and avoiding eye contact. "Before I tell you this," he said, "I need you to understand that David was in trouble, real trouble, and what he did, I think he thought it was his only way out." He pulled out his phone and showed me an email chain from March 2014. The corporate email signatures confirmed these were authentic communications from David's firm. David's Beijing trip was cancelled on March 5th, Marcus said, scrolling through the messages. The client pulled out at the last minute. The project that was supposed to save his business fell through. I stared at the emails, dated 3 days before David's flight, but he still went to Malaysia. He still got on that plane. "That's what I could never understand," Marcus said. "Why would he book a different flight to a different destination for a meeting that didn't exist? Unless, what?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Unless someone else wanted him on that plane. Someone who knew it was going to disappear." The words hit me like ice water. That's impossible. You're talking about conspiracy theories, I'm talking about what I saw with my own eyes. Marcus interrupted. David met with someone in February, someone who scared him. After that meeting, he was different, paranoid. He kept asking me questions about life insurance policies, about what happens to families when someone goes missing versus when they die. I thought about the credit card statement, those mysterious trips to Seattle and Vancouver that David had never mentioned. Do you know who he met with? I never saw the person, but I know it was someone from his past, someone who had leverage over him. Marcus pulled up another email, this one from David to the airline. Look at this. David changed his flight 3 times in the week before he traveled. He was supposed to be on a direct flight to Beijing on March 7. Then he changed to the Malaysia Airlines Flight through Kuala Lumpur. Why would he do that? I think someone told him to. I think David was supposed to be on MH370, Mrs. Chen, and I think someone made sure that plane never reached Beijing. That night, I did something I'd avoided for 10 years. I opened David's laptop. The password was our wedding anniversary, 2009, which broke my heart all over again. If David was planning to disappear, would he really use such a personal password? Or was that exactly what he wanted me to think? His browser history told a story I wasn't prepared for. In February 2014, David had researched life insurance fraud detection, penalties for faking death, and countries with no extradition treaties to the United States. He'd visited forums about disappearing and starting new identities. He'd looked up the requirements for presumptive death declarations, but there were other searches that confused me. MH370 passenger manifest, Flight 370 crew background checks, Malaysian airport security protocols. Why would David research the very flight he was supposedly randomly booked on? Then I found the encrypted files. David had always been security conscious with his consulting work. But these files were different. They required a password I didn't know, and there were dozens of them, all created in the weeks before his disappearance. The file names were cryptic: insurance_backup, emergency_protocols, family_protection. I called my neighbor Jake, who worked in Can you help me crack some password-protected files? Jake came over that evening with his laptop and some software I probably didn't want to know too much about. After 3 hours, we'd broken into 2 of the files. The first contained scanned copies of our insurance policies, bank account statements, and a detailed financial analysis of our debts. David owed $200,000 more than I'd known about failed investments, business loans, credit cards I'd never seen. We weren't just financially struggling, we were drowning. The second file was a timeline of meetings and phone calls, all with someone identified only as TC. The entries were brief but ominous. February 12, TC Seattle meeting, proposal discussed. February 18, TC Vancouver follow-up, terms negotiated. February 25, TC final meeting, agreement reached. March 1, flight arrangements confirmed, timeline set. March 5, Beijing project cancelled. Window opened. Jake whistled low as we read through the entries. Sarah, this looks like your husband was planning something with this TC person. Something that involved his death, or his disappearance, I corrected, though the distinction felt smaller every minute. The final entry, dated March 7, the day before David's flight, contained just 4 words: trust the process. Goodbye, TC, Tom Chen, David's older brother. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd always known Tom as the successful one, the brother who'd made it big in real estate development, who drove expensive cars and lived in a mansion in Marin County. Tom had been supportive after David disappeared, checking on me regularly, even offering financial help that I'd been too proud to accept. Now, I wondered if his generosity came from guilt. I spent 2 days building up the courage to look into Tom's finances. I had access to David's business accounts, and Tom had been a partner in several of David's consulting projects. If money had changed hands, there might be records. What I found made me physically sick. 3 weeks after MH370 disappeared, Tom had received a wire transfer of $500,000 from a Cayman Islands bank account. The money had been transferred to a business account linked to one of David's consulting projects, a project Tom had supposedly inherited after David's disappearance. 6 months later, another transfer, $250,000, same source. Over the past 10 years, Tom had received nearly $2 million in payments connected to David's estate, money that should have been impossible to access without a death certificate. I drove to Tom's house in Sausalito, my hands shaking as I rang his doorbell. He answered in golf clothes, his face lighting up with the warm smile I'd always associated with family barbecues and holiday gatherings. "Sarah, what a nice surprise. Come in." I was just about to make coffee. I followed him into his kitchen, looking around at the granite countertops and high-end appliances with new eyes. "Tom, we need to talk about David." Something flickered across his face: fear, guilt, resignation. "What about David?" I pulled out the bank statements I'd printed. "About the money you've been receiving. About TC. About what really happened to my husband." Tom's coffee mug slipped from his hands, shattering on the tile floor. He didn't move to clean it up, just stared at the papers in my hands. "Sarah, you don't understand the situation David was in. He was desperate. The business was failing. He owed money to the wrong people, and they were threatening to come after you. So you helped him fake his death. I helped him disappear before someone killed him for real." Tom's voice was barely a whisper. "The insurance money was supposed to take care of you. David made me promise the money would go to you once enough time had passed." "Where is he, Tom?" Tom closed his eyes. "I don't know. That was the deal. I helped him get out, but I was never supposed to know where he went. For everyone's protection. He's alive." The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. "As far as I know, yes, David is alive." Tom's confession unraveled everything. We sat in his living room for 3 hours as he told me the truth about David's final months. The debt, the threats, and the elaborate plan they'd constructed together. "David owed money to Marcus Volkov," Tom said, naming a Russian businessman known for his violent methods of debt collection. $200,000 from a failed investment deal that went bad. Volkov gave David until April 1st to pay up or he'd start targeting family. Tom showed me forged medical records they'd created, indicating David had terminal cancer with 6 months to live. The plan was to establish a medical reason for David to travel, seeking treatment abroad. Then we'd use the MH370 disappearance as cover. "You knew the plane was going to crash?" "No," Tom said quickly. "God, no. We just knew flights disappeared sometimes, especially in that region." David researched dozens of routes and airlines, looking for the one with the highest risk profile. When MH370's passenger manifest showed several passengers with suspicious backgrounds, David thought it was perfect cover. The coldness of it took my breath away. David had chosen MH370, not randomly, but strategically, gambling that a plane with suspicious passengers might disappear or be hijacked, giving him the perfect opportunity to vanish. How did he get off the plane? He never got on it. Tom pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. David at what looked like a small airport, wearing different clothes than what he'd left our house in. This was taken in Kuala Lumpur on March 8th, about 2 hours after MH370 took off. David bribed a baggage handler to scan his boarding pass and mark him as boarded. He hid in the storage room until the plane left, then flew to Thailand on a private charter. I stared at the photo. David looked different thinner, nervous, but very much alive. In the background, I could see a timestamp. March 8, 2014, 3:47 a.m. "The insurance money was supposed to be for you," Tom continued. "David made me promise to wait exactly 7 years, then file for presumptive death and transfer everything to you. He thought 7 years would be enough time for Volkov to lose interest and for the MH370 investigation to be forgotten, but you kept the money." Tom's face crumpled with shame. "At first, I was just managing it. But then my own business hit trouble, and I borrowed against it. I kept telling myself I'd pay it back, that you'd never need to know. I thought David was never coming back. Where is he now? I honestly don't know." We set up one communication method, a coded message system through a travel blog website. David was supposed to check in every 6 months to let me know he was safe. The last message I got was 3 years ago. Tom showed me the blog, a generic travel website with posts about Southeast Asian destinations. Buried in the comments were coded messages. "Great tips for Phuket beaches, DC." Posted in June 22. David had been alive, at least until 3 years ago, living somewhere in Thailand under an assumed identity, while I spent a decade grieving a man who had chosen to abandon me. I hired a private investigator named Rebecca Torres, a former FBI agent who specialized in international missing persons cases. When I showed her the travel blog messages and Tom's confession, her expression shifted from skeptical to grimly determined. "If your husband is alive and living in Thailand, I can find him," she said. "But I need you to be prepared for what that means. Are you ready to confront the man who let you grieve for 10 years? I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready, but I needed to know. Rebecca worked for 6 weeks, following digital breadcrumbs and reaching out to contacts in Southeast Asia. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, facial recognition match from a tourist photo posted on social media. Rebecca called me on a Tuesday morning in June. I found him. She sent me a surveillance photo taken outside a beach resort in Koh Samui, Thailand. The man in the image was older, tanned, with longer hair and a beard. But there was no mistaking those eyes, that distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. David was alive. He was living under the name Daniel Carter, working as a dive instructor at a resort called Paradise Waters. According to Rebecca's research, he'd been there for at least 3 years, living simply but comfortably in a small apartment above the dive shop. "He's not hiding," Rebecca told me. "He has social media accounts, regular routines. Even what appears to be a girlfriend, a local woman named Nim, who works at the resort's restaurant." The girlfriend detail hit me like a physical blow. Not only had David abandoned me, he'd moved on, built a new life, found love again while I spent 10 years in suspended animation. Rebecca provided more photos: David teaching diving classes, 2 tourists, David and Nim laughing at a beachside bar, David looking relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen in the months before his disappearance. He looked like a man without burdens, without debt, without the crushing weight of deception. "What do you want to do?" Rebecca asked. I stared at the photos for a long time. Part of me wanted to fly to Thailand immediately, to confront him at that resort in front of his new girlfriend and his oblivious diving students. Part of me wanted to call the authorities and have him arrested for fraud. But mostly, I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how the man I'd loved, the man I'd married, could have orchestrated such cruelty with such precision. I want to talk to him first, I decided, before anyone else knows he's been found. Rebecca nodded. "I can arrange contact, but Sarah, once you open this door, you can't close it again." Rebecca obtained David's phone number through the dive shop's booking system. I practiced what I'd say for 3 days before finally dialing the international number, my hands trembling as the call connected. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Paradise Waters Dive Center. This is Dan." Dan. Even his voice sounded different, more relaxed, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Hello, David." The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then, barely a whisper, "Sarah, yes, it's me. How did you?" His voice cracked. "Sarah, I can explain. Can you explain how you let me think you were dead for 10 years? Can you explain how you attended your own memorial service in spirit while I stood there crying over your empty grave?" I'd set up a recording app before making the call. Whatever David said, I wanted proof. "Sarah, please. You don't understand the situation I was in. Marcus Volkov was going to kill me. He was going to hurt you. I had to disappear to protect both of us. So you chose to torture me instead, to let me live in limbo for a decade while you built a new life with someone else." Another long pause. "You know about Nim. I know about everything. David, the debt, the fake medical records, Tom's involvement, the insurance fraud. I know you researched MH370 before you boarded it. I know you planned this whole thing down to the last detail." David's breathing became ragged. I'd never meant for it to last this long. "The plan was to wait a few years until Volkov lost interest, then find a way to contact you. But then you seemed to be moving on, and I thought maybe it was better if I stayed dead." "Moving on." My voice rose. "I haven't moved on. I've been frozen in place since March 8, 2014. I lost our house, my career, my ability to trust anyone. I've spent 10 years visiting psychics and conspiracy theorists because I couldn't accept that you were gone. How is that moving on?" "I'm sorry," David whispered. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. You took the coward's way out and left me to deal with the consequences. What are you going to do now?" His voice was small, defeated. I looked at the recording app, watching the minutes tick by. "I'm going to do what you should have done 10 years ago. I'm going to tell the truth. Sarah, please. If you turn me in, I'll go to prison for insurance fraud, and Volca V might still be looking for people to hurt. This could put you in danger. I've been in danger every day for 10 years, David. Danger of never healing, never moving forward, never knowing if I was a wife or a widow. You made that choice for me. Now, I'm making my own choices. The call ended with David pleading for time to figure out a solution, but I'd already made my decision. The time for his solutions had ended the moment he stepped off that plane in Kuala Lumpur. After confronting David, I went to the FBI. Agent Patricia Williams, who specialized in international fraud cases, listened to my story and the recorded phone call with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd seen cases like this before. Insurance fraud involving presumed death is more common than people think, she explained, but using a real tragedy like MH370 as cover that's particularly sophisticated in your husband's case could be part of a larger network. Agent Williams connected me with Interpol agents who'd been investigating irregularities in the MH370 passenger manifest for years. What they told me shattered any remaining illusions about David's plan being a desperate solo act. We've identified at least 12 passengers on MH370 who had connections to insurance fraud or identity theft rings. Agent Chen, no relation to David, explained via video call from Malaysia. Your husband's name appeared in our database 3 years ago. When we traced communications between several of these individuals, they showed me evidence that David hadn't chosen MH370 randomly. He'd been part of a network that specialized in helping people disappear using real disasters as cover. The baggage handler he'd bribed, the airline employee who'd falsified records, even the forged medical documents, all part of a sophisticated operation that had been running for years. We believe this network has helped dozens of people fake their deaths using various disasters. Agent Chen continued. Plane crashes, natural disasters, terrorist attacks. They wait for real tragedies, then insert their clients into the victim lists. The scope of it was breathtaking. David hadn't just betrayed me, he'd participated in exploiting real tragedies, real families' grief, for profit. Agent Williams showed me the flight manifest forgery they'd uncovered. David's name had been added to the passenger list after the plane disappeared, using credentials stolen from Malaysia Airlines computer system. The same system had been used to add other passengers who were actually alive and hiding elsewhere. Your husband paid approximately $100,000 for this service, Agent Williams explained. Money that came from liquidating business assets and borrowing against your home. I thought about our mortgage struggles, the bills I'd juggled while David was supposedly dead. He'd spent our security to purchase his freedom, leaving me with debt and grief while he started fresh in paradise. But the most devastating revelation came from phone records the FBI had obtained through international cooperation. David had been in contact with Tom throughout his disappearance, not through the coded blog messages Tom had shown me, but through encrypted messaging apps and cryptocurrency payments. Tom hadn't been a reluctant accomplice. He'd been a full partner, receiving regular updates on David's new life and even helping him establish his identity as Daniel Kata. The money Tom had received wasn't just insurance fraud proceeds, it was payment for ongoing services, including monitoring my activities and ensuring I didn't get too close to the truth. Your brother-in-law has been reporting on your daily life to your husband for 10 years, Agent Williams told me gently. Every time you seemed close to moving on or accepting David's death, Tom would warn him. The betrayal was complete. Not only had David abandoned me, but he'd used his brother to spy on me, to ensure I remained trapped in grief while he lived freely thousands of miles away. I spent 3 days writing my legal affidavit, documenting every detail of David's deception and its impact on my life. Agent Williams guided me through the process, helping me organize 10 years of evidence into a coherent narrative that would support criminal charges. The affidavit began with our marriage in 2009 and David's gradual descent into financial trouble, hidden from me until it was too late. It detailed the fake medical records, the mysterious meetings with TC, the carefully planned use of MH370 as cover for his disappearance. Most importantly, it documented the emotional and financial devastation his choices had inflicted on me and other family members. This document will be used by prosecutors in multiple countries, Agent Williams explained. Your husband's case involves fraud in the United States, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Cayman Islands. Each jurisdiction will file separate charges. I also prepared a victim impact statement, knowing that eventually David would face trial and I'd have the opportunity to tell a court exactly what his decade of deception had cost me. Emma was with me when I signed the final documents. She'd been devastated to learn the truth, but her shock had quickly transformed into fierce protective anger. "I can't believe I encouraged you to let go," she said, tears streaming down her face. "All those times I told you to accept his death and move on. He was living on a beach, laughing with his girlfriend while you were suffering. You were trying to help me heal," I told her. "You couldn't have known." But Emma's guilt was nothing compared to my own feelings about the other MH370 families. I'd attended support group meetings with them, shared their grief, accepted their comfortable while knowing now that my husband had exploited their real tragedy for his personal gain. I contacted several of the other families personally, explaining what I'd discovered and offering to help with any legal action they might want to pursue. Most were supportive, understanding that I'd been as much a victim as they were. A few were angry, feeling betrayed by association. I couldn't blame them. The investigation moved quickly once authorities had David's location and phone records. International cooperation led to raids on the document forgers in Malaysia, the baggage handler who'd helped falsify passenger manifests, and the bank officials in the Cayman Islands who'd processed fraudulent insurance payments. Tom was arrested at his Sausalito home on a Tuesday morning. I watched the news coverage from Emma's apartment, seeing him led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions about his role in defrauding his own family. 2 days later, Agent Williams called with the news I'd been waiting for. Thai authorities have arrested David Chen, also known as Daniel Carter, at the Paradise Waters Resort in Koh Samui. He'll be extradited to the United States to face fraud charges. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just a strange emptiness, as if a chapter of my life was finally ending, but I wasn't sure what the next chapter would contain. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now, you get to start living your real life," Agent Williams said. "The life you should have had all along." The arrest warrant arrived on my doorstep like a formal apology from the universe. Seeing David's real name listed alongside his crimes: insurance fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to defraud, exploitation of a mass casualty event, felt like official validation of everything I'd endured. David was extradited from Thailand. 3 weeks later, I watched the news footage of him being escorted off the plane at San Francisco International Airport. His hands cuffed, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses. He looked smaller than I remembered, older and somehow diminished. The confident man who'd kissed me goodbye 10 years ago had been replaced by someone who looked defeated before his trial even began. Tom's trial came first. The evidence against him was overwhelming: bank records, communications with David, testimony from other family members who'd watched me struggle while Tom lived comfortably on fraud proceeds. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. During Tom's sentencing hearing, I read a victim impact statement that I'd worked on for weeks. Tom Chen didn't just defraud insurance companies or violate banking laws. He stole 10 years of my life. He watched me lose my home, my savings, my ability to trust, and he said nothing. He attended family dinners where I cried about missing David, offered comfort while knowing it was all based on lies. The cruelest part wasn't the money, it was the deliberate prolonging of my grief for his financial benefits. The judge sentenced Tom to pay restitution of $1.8 million plus interest, essentially every penny he'd received from the fraud scheme. The money would help, but it couldn't restore the decade I'd lost. David's trial was more complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and international witnesses. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who'd systematically planned an elaborate fraud scheme, exploiting one of aviation's greatest tragedies for personal gain. His defense attorney argued that David had been forced into the scheme by threats from Marcus Volkov, that he was a victim who'd been driven to desperate measures. They painted him as a loving husband who'd sacrificed everything to protect his family. I testified for 3 hours, describing our marriage, David's hidden debts, and the devastating impact of his decade-long deception. When David's attorney cross-examined me, trying to suggest I should have known about his financial troubles, I felt a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. "David was my husband, not my business partner," I said firmly. I trusted him completely, because that's what marriage is supposed to be: a partnership built on honesty. He exploited that trust to hide his crimes and then abandoned me to deal with the consequences. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the insurance companies, the other MH370 families, and me. After David's sentencing, I returned to our old house, the one I'd lost to foreclosure 3 years. After his disappearance, the new owners had renovated it completely, painting over the memories I'd clung to for so long. Standing on the sidewalk where I'd once waited for David to come home, I felt something shift inside me. I pulled out our original wedding photo, the one I'd carried in my wallet for 10 years, like a talisman. We looked so young, so hopeful, so completely unaware of what was coming. For the first time, I could look at that photo and see it clearly, not as evidence of lost love, but as documentation of a relationship that had never been what I thought it was. Emma found me there an hour later, sitting on the curb with the photo in my hands. "Are you okay?" she asked, settling beside me. "I'm trying to figure out when he stopped loving me," I said, "or if he ever really did." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe that's the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "Maybe the question isn't when he stopped loving you. Maybe it's when you started loving yourself enough to demand the truth." I thought about that as we drove home. For 10 years, I'd defined myself by David's absence, by the hole he'd left in my life. I'd been Sarah whose husband disappeared, Sarah MH370 widow, Sarah-who-couldn, single quotes, T-move-on. But who was I, now that the truth was out? That evening, I went through boxes of our belongings I'd kept in storage. Letters David had written me during our courtship, full of promises about our future together. Photos from our honeymoon, our anniversary celebrations, holidays with family, Christmas ornaments we'd bought together, planning for Christmases we'd never share. Each item felt like evidence in a case I was still trying to solve. How much of our relationship had been real? Had David loved me when he proposed, when we bought our first house, when he talked about starting a family? Or had I been living in a fiction from the very beginning? I found my journal from 2013, the year before David disappeared. Reading my entries from that time was like archaeology excavating layers of a life I'd forgotten. I'd written about David working late more often, about phone calls he'd taken private, about his increasing stress, about work. The signs had been there, but I'd interpreted them as normal marriage challenges, not evidence of criminal planning. David seems distant lately. I'd written in November 2013. When I ask about work, he changes the subject. "I hope everything's okay with the business." David mentioned maybe taking a long vacation next year. From January 2014. Somewhere tropical where we could disappear from everything. I love that he's thinking about us time, even his hints about disappearing. I'd romanticized as relationship goals rather than recognizing them as literal plans. But I also found evidence of genuine moments, David comforting me when my father died, surprising me with weekend getaways, supporting my career changes. Those memories couldn't all be fabricated, could they? The truth, I realized, was more complex than either complete love or complete deception. David had probably loved me in whatever way he was capable of loving anyone. But when forced to choose between his love for me and his fear for himself, he'd chosen himself. That wasn't necessarily evil, it was human, selfish, cowardly, and devastating. But human. 6 months after David's sentencing, I started a consulting business helping other families navigate insurance fraud investigations. The work came naturally. I understood the bureaucratic maze, the emotional manipulation tactics, the way institutions could abandon people in their most vulnerable moments. My first client was Maria Santos, whose husband had supposedly died in a construction accident in Mexico. Like me, she'd been fighting for death benefits while suspecting her husband might still be alive. Using techniques I'd learned from Rebecca Torres and the FBI, we tracked Maria's husband to a small town in Guatemala, where he'd been living with another family for 2 years. "How did you know to keep looking?" Maria asked me after we'd confronted her husband and initiated legal proceedings. "Because I know what it feels like when something doesn't make sense," I told her. "Trust your instincts, even when everyone else tells you to accept what seems obvious." The business grew through word of mouth. Insurance companies began referring complicated cases to me, knowing I had unique insight into how fraud schemes worked and how to identify inconsistencies that others might miss. Within a year, I'd helped expose 12 different fake death schemes and recover over $3 million in fraudulent payouts. I moved to a new apartment in Oakland, finally ready to live somewhere that didn't carry memories of David. Emma helped me pick out furniture, and we had a housewarming party where I introduced myself to neighbors as simply Sarah, not as someone's widow or victim. At that party, I met James Hoffman, a documentary filmmaker who was working on a project about MH370 families. He was different from David in every way that mattered, open about his work, his feelings, his past. When he asked me on a date 3 weeks later, I said yes despite my terror. I should warn you, I told him over coffee. I have trust issues, like serious, professionally diagnosed trust issues. James smiled. I should warn you that I'm probably the most boring person you'll ever date. I research everything obsessively. I tell terrible dad jokes even though I don't have kids. And I cry at movies about dogs. Those sound like selling points to me. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully. James never pushed for information I wasn't ready to share, never tried to fix my past or rush my healing. When I told him the full story about David, he listened, without judgment, and then asked a question that surprised me. What do you want to do with all that knowledge and strength you've gained? I realized that was the first time anyone had asked me to think about my experience as a source of power, rather than just trauma. I want to help other people find their truth, I said, even when the truth is complicated or painful. Then that's what you should do. James documented my work with insurance fraud cases, creating a short film that aired on PBS and brought national attention to the problem of staged deaths. The publicity led to speaking engagements at conferences, consulting, work with law enforcement agencies, and eventually a book deal to tell my story. Writing the book was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Organizing the timeline, analyzing the patterns, understanding how David's scheme had worked, it all helped me see my experience as a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end, rather than an endless loop of questions and pain. 2 years after David's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. The letter was 4 pages of handwritten apology, explanation, and regret. David wrote about his life in prison, his therapy sessions, his growing understanding of the damage he'd caused. He claimed to have found religion, to have realized the magnitude of his selfishness, to be truly sorry for the first time. But what struck me most was a single paragraph near the end. I know you'll probably never forgive me, and I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that loving you was the most real thing in my life, even if I destroyed it with my cowardice. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. I hope you've found the happiness I was too broken to provide. I read that paragraph several times before I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no residual love. David had become a stranger to me, someone from my past whose actions had shaped my present but no longer controlled my future. I never wrote back. Instead, I prepared my final victim impact statement for David's parole hearing, which wouldn't occur for another 8 years but required advanced documentation. Standing in the federal courthouse conference room, reading my statement to the parole board via video link, I felt the completion of a journey that had taken me from victim to survivor to advocate. David Chen robbed me of 10 years, but he gave me something to clarity about my own strength and the importance of truth. His betrayal taught me that I could survive anything, that I was more resilient than I'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you build afterward. I looked directly into the camera, knowing David might be watching from his prison cell. I don't forgive him, and I don't hate him. He's simply irrelevant to my life now. I've built something better than what we had, a life based on honesty, surrounded by people who choose to be here, doing work that matters. That's the justice I needed, and I found it myself. After the hearing, James and I drove to Grace Cathedral, where I'd held David's memorial service 4 years earlier. This time, I wasn't there to grieve, but to formally say goodbye to the woman I'd been, the woman who'd defined herself by someone else's absence. I left a single white rose on the steps where I'd once cried for a man who wasn't dead, then walked away without looking back. 6 months later, James and I were married in a small ceremony in Emma's backyard. I kept my maiden name and wore a blue dress instead of white. We wrote our own vows, promising honesty above all else, communication instead of assumptions, and the courage to face difficulties together rather than apart. The night before our wedding, Emma asked if I ever wondered what would have happened if David had never disappeared, if he'd found a different way to handle his debts and fears. Sometimes, I admitted, But then I remembered that the man I thought I married never really existed. David showed me who he was when faced with impossible choices. This version of my life, difficult as it's been, is built on truth. I wouldn't trade that for a beautiful lie. Today, I run a successful consulting firm, speak at conferences about fraud prevention, and help other people find closure in impossible situations. I have a husband who tells me when he's scared, when he's struggling, when he needs help. I have work that gives meaning to everything I've survived. Some nights, I still dream about MH370, about planes disappearing into dark oceans. But in my dreams now, I'm not searching for David. I'm helping other people find their way home. That's the life I built from the wreckage of my marriage, a life where truth matters more than comfort, where helping others heal has become my own healing, where the worst betrayal became the foundation for the most authentic love I've ever known. David took 10 years from me, but I've made those years count in ways he never could have imagined. And that, finally, feels like justice.